building up upon what we did last time with Boolean connectives, and one of the key concepts coming out of this homework is the notion of main connective. I talked about this last time, but it's really important for the rest of the course. It basically indicates what the main connective is about. It indicates the structure of the thought that you're trying to convey. Take a look here. I have an example right here. I have this sentence. I have it in the abstract. G and B or N. And G and B or N. They look the same, these two. The only difference is where I put the parentheses. So in the first case, these two are grouped together. And in the second case, the B and N are grouped together. What's the main connective? If you remember from last time, the main connective is identified by what's outside of parentheses or what's left, quote unquote, unquote, left over, right? So in the first case, what's left over, meaning outside parentheses, is the or. And in the second case, what's left over, what remains, what's outside of parentheses, is the and. That means the first sentence is an or statement, the second sentence is an and statement. And this, even though they look the same, this means they convey differing thoughts. Let's make this concrete to illustrate just how different they can be. Suppose it's Christmas and you've got a rich uncle, and a really rich uncle, and you're given the following two statements. And the question is, which of the two do you prefer, right? So if you look at the first one, let's suppose it says, you got options here, kid. You can get either a new car and you get a new car and a bag of chips, or I don't know, what do you guys want? What's expensive? A new motorbike? A diamond ring? A diamond necklace? Sure, diamond necklace. That sounds expensive. So you get a new car and a bag of chips. That's pretty crappy. Or a diamond necklace, right? You're like, the idea here is you got options, or. So you weigh them up. On the left side, you got the new car and bag of chips. And on the other side, you got the diamond ring. And let's suppose it's exclusive, or it's one or the other, not both, right? So it's got to be one or the other, but you can't choose both. Whereas the second option says, I'm giving you the car and you can have a bag of chips or a diamond necklace. I mean, there's no contest, right? In the first case, you got to weigh them up and choose one or the other, not both. In the second case, you're being given the car, and now you got a silly choice, a bag of chips or a diamond necklace. Now, unless that bag of chips is really something special, or maybe you can't control your hunger, the point is, it's obvious that you want this second one, not the first one, right? And that conveys, the point here is, by virtue of the way in which they're structured, the main connective gives you differing thoughts. And in some cases, the differing thoughts can be very, very different. All right. So, moving on, the first thing to cover is this thing called De Morgan's equivalences. It's named after the person who came up with this. This kind of equivalence shows, there's two of them. They show up over and over again, so it's worth your time to memorize this stuff. And part of what logic is about is seeing forms or patterns in the way people speak or say things or think, and recognizing their equivalents. Yeah. So this notion of form or pattern, that's crucial to logic. Here are forms that are equivalent. So not parentheses P or Q, its form is not parentheses or, is equivalent to not P and not Q. Let me illustrate that. If I say I'm neither going to the game nor eating a hot dog, that's equivalent to I'm not going to the game and I'm not eating a hot dog. In fact, this is sort of like mathematics. You can think of this not here as negation, or sorry, not here as minus, subtraction, negative, right? And the or is, let's say, times or whatever, or plus, better yet, plus. When you distribute through, it changes the operator, right? Likewise here, when you distribute through, you get not P, and it flips the sign over to and not Q. And this is not coincidental. There's a higher order logic called Boolean algebra, upon which what you learned in high school mathematics, this stuff is based. Logic is, as I mentioned before, at the base of much of mathematics. So that distribution is not just a coincidental parallel. There's a reason for that. Okay, the other De Morgan's form, that first one's pretty straightforward. Everyone is familiar with neither nor. Neither this nor that means not this and not that. Right? The second De Morgan's form is the trickier one, and it's the one people often make mistakes with. Not parentheses P and Q the form here is not parentheses and. The first form was not parentheses or. Neither nor is that form, not parentheses or. The second form, not parentheses and, that's the not both form, and it's equivalent to not P or not Q. People often mistake not P and Q with not P and not Q. They think that it goes through, right? If I see not P and Q, that means not P and also not Q, but it's not. That's too strong. It's actually weaker than that. It's when you distribute through, it's not P or not Q. Let me use a concrete example to illustrate why that's the case, okay? So if I tell you P and Q here is, let's suppose we're talking about the playoffs for whatever. Let's say World Series, right? I don't know. I don't follow baseball. I'll make it up. The White Sox and the Yankees. It's not the case that both the White Sox and the Yankees win the game, right? That's true. You cannot have both of them being joint winners. Can't we all just get along? No, it doesn't work that way, unfortunately. So it's not the case that both of them win. Does that thereby mean not P and not Q, meaning the White Sox don't win and the Yankees don't win? No, that's too strong. That means both go home losers. Then what's the point of having a playoff game, right? What's the point of having the World Series? So when you say not both can win, what you mean more weakly is that either the White Sox don't win or the Yankees don't win, meaning at least one of them loses. Yeah? So that's not both, and that's the other major De Morgan's form. This part right here is about translations. I have a video taking you through translation, so I'm gonna, for right now, pass on this. I'll come back to it maybe a bit later and just briefly cover let's start some of the homework. So 3.15 is your first homework problem, and if you notice, I basically take you through the reasoning of how this works right here. 3.16 I just took you through. 3.18 is Bernays' sentences, and it's basically trying to find equivalent ways of saying the same thing. So if you say A is right of B, what's an equivalent way of saying that without saying right of? You say left of, right? And you just invert it. Use the audio file as well as the picture files to guide you there. It's 21 that's the really important one for this package. I have a video here to guide you, but to sort of set the stage for this, besides the video which actually works through the problems, let me give you some conceptual background for how this works. So you can watch this, come back to this again before you get to 21, the video that I have there, in addition to the picture files and the audio files. So this is that part I mentioned earlier. How do you do translations? Well, you first look for connective words, and, both, but also indicate and, or either, and there's some others indicate or, and then not is basically not, right? So when you do translations, I have here what's called an algorithm. An algorithm is, if you remember from before, nothing more than a fancy way of talking about a recipe. A recipe is a sequence. If you follow something in sequence, it produces a certain product, right? So a recipe for, let's say, chopped steak. Step 1, chop onions. Step 2, fry it in the pan with the vegetables you chop. Step 3, add meat, etc., right? The idea is if you follow the recipe in sequence, it produces an outcome. The problem is, if for any of you who've done any cooking, if you just follow the recipe and that's it, does that guarantee a tasty product? Absolutely not. In fact, very often you might say, I followed everything. Why does this taste so bad? Or it doesn't taste that good. What's wrong? Like with everything else in life, the art is what matters. The recipe is just a beginning sort of sequence, and what matters later on is the way in which you put it together, the art of cooking in this case. Likewise with algorithms in general, it's the art of learning to follow directions that gets you to a more artful product. This holds for logic and many other things in life. So what we have here is an algorithm, a simple one, and initially it'll seem straightforward, but what you're going to find pretty quickly is that the art of applying this is more difficult than it seems, and that's where you're going to have to learn the art of learning translations. What I mean by translations is always from English into our language, into predicate logic, or as the book's calling it, FOL, first order logic. Yeah. So how do you do that? How do you practice this art? So the first thing to do is identify the main connective in the English sentence. The main connective is identified by those kinds of words, and, both, not, or, either. Secondly, you write down that connective in our language, in our symbolic language, and then you chunk each of the sides. You put parentheses around both sides if it's an and or. If it's a not, you put parentheses afterwards. And then you keep breaking down the things you put in parentheses. This is step 3. And you follow basically this. This is what's called a recursive algorithm. You keep repeating steps 1, 2, and 3 until you cannot break the thing down anymore. To illustrate, here's a simple example. Here's your English sentence. Either B is a large cube or F is small but not a dodec. How do you know what the main connective is? Well, I have several main connective words. Either goes with or, and then I've got but, and I've got not. But is and. I'm going to the game, but I'm not eating a hot dog. I'm going to the game and I'm not eating a hot dog. But is and, not is not. Okay? So you got 3 connective words. Not, but, and either. Either goes with or. That's one connective. They form a pair. The main connective in this case is determined by the structure of the thought. So if you think about it, since the sentence starts off with either, it's giving you options. That's the main connective. That's laying out the structure of the thought. Okay? So I write down the or first, and then I chunk each of the sides. I put in parentheses each of the sides. So there's the or, and then on the left side I have B is a large cube, and on the right side I have F is small but not a dodec. Okay, I repeat then that same process applied to each of the components until I can't break them down anymore. So B is a large cube. That's actually B is large and B is a cube. And on the right side, F is small but not a dodec. That's actually F is small and F is not a dodec, right? And then breaking down the left side some more, and is and, so B is large, B is a cube. I break down B is large to just large B, and B is a cube to cube B. And on the right side, F is small, small f. F is not a dodec, so not dodec, not F is a dodec, so not dodec F. And that completes the process. That's the complete breakdown of the sentence, and it ends there. This notion of recursive algorithm is incredibly powerful. Let me give you some philosophical background to this before you get to the homework. The homework, again, you can read it here, 321, and I have the link down here for the video to take you through that. But before we get to that, let me give you some examples, some more practical examples. You might ask, okay, we're doing translations now, how does that matter? Well, this notion of recursive algorithm is incredibly powerful. If you go to Google and you type in fractal, here's an example of all of these kinds of beautiful pictures. They're called fractals. And the basic idea behind a fractal is it's something applied to itself, right? A simple example of a fractal, which is this notion of recursive algorithm, something applied to itself, is what's called the Koch snowflake. I'm going to type that in. Fractal Koch snowflake. Okay? So you see all these things right here? Here's how it's generated. Let's look at the top. I'll click on it right here. You have a triangle, and then on each of the sides of the triangle you add on smaller triangles, and then on each of those sides of the smaller triangles you add on further smaller triangles until you keep going, applied to itself, until you get something that looks kind of like a snowflake. That's the same notion of what we're encountering in our how to break down translations, our recursive algorithm, right? You identify the main connective, you chunk the pieces. You then look inside each of the sides that are parenthesized, and you identify the main connective there, and then break them down further. And you keep going until you can't go any further. All these kinds of fractal structures are the same type of process. The only difference is it goes on for infinity. Okay? So there's a bunch of these. They look pretty, but they all follow the same pattern. Let me see if I can find. There's something like called a fractal type universe. Okay, here, this cylindrical looking thing. This is not the best picture, but it's good enough. The idea here is, if you look at this overall thing, it's a pattern. If you were to focus in on this small portion, or any portion right here, but let's say take down right there. If I focused in, zoomed in with a lens, highest power lens, I'm going to find that this overall pattern is repeated on that smaller scale. If I then zoom in within that small portion even further, I'm going to find this same overall pattern repeated again and again. And that's all that these fractals are. They're the same. They're sometimes called self-similar structures. Okay, so you might think, interesting, pretty pictures. Yeah, so what? Now, type in fractal landscape. This is where it starts to get really interesting. Look at these pictures. I mean, look at how realistic they look. All of these pictures, they're landscapes that are computer generated. They're not actually real, okay? That is to say, they're not true landscapes that you take outside in the world, but boy, do they look like it. This is one of the key revolutions they had in computer graphics. If you remember back in the day, especially with science fiction movies, which is where they first started using this stuff. In fact, I think it was like Star Trek, if I remember my history correctly, when I read about this stuff a while back. There was that Genesis program, and that was one of the first computer uses of fractals. But anyway, the point is, prior to that, in graphics, they would have to create landscapes or whatnot, and it didn't look very good. And then all of a sudden, somewhere down the line, when they started using computer graphics, it got better, but it was still not totally convincing. Then, further down the line, everything started looking really good. It wasn't just the digital revolution. They started introducing a new technique, fractal landscapes. You've seen like Lord of the Rings, for example. All of these things are, for the most part, a lot of these created landscapes are not real. I mean, parts of it are, but a whole series of things is not. Clearly, it's a fictional movie, right? How did they do that? They use these fractal landscapes. What are they? Well, the idea is it takes that same notion of a fractal that we just covered, but they're too perfect, too pristine, too pretty, as it were. So you hit it with some noise. You like put some kinks in it. So they added some variations to the fractals, and they basically let programs run with all these various fractals with kinks in them, with mistakes, as it were, purposeful mistakes in them, and they don't know what they're going to generate. The computer scientists don't know how it's going to work. They let them run, and it generates these beautiful, pretty fractal landscapes. Philosophically, here's where it's get interesting. This is sort of at the cutting edge of science and philosophy and exploration into the cosmos, what's sometimes also known as metaphysics. Metaphysics is sort of like big questions concerning things that we don't have definitive answers to. But by its nature, it needs to be explored and inquired about, even if there isn't any definitive answer, and may never have a definitive answer. One of these questions that metaphysics deal with is, what's the nature of the universe? What undergirds it? What underpins it? What's our place in that, right? So one way in which these fractal ideas have been applied is that the reason they speculate that why these things look so darn realistic is because they are literally in our world. And the more scientists started exploring this, and philosophers and others, they found fractal patterns everywhere. They find that it's in the cosmos, it's in the nature of the universe and how it's structured. It's in our DNA, it's in our brain patterns and how our brains are wired. It just shows up over and over again. A simple example, a fractal occurs in something as simple as a tree. Yeah? So if you type it, what is a tree? It goes and it branches, and then each of those branches branch. These are perfect fractals, but if you hit it with some noise, as I told you before, you get things that look more like our trees. It's that same type of pattern applied to itself. Stepping back from all of this, what undergirds it all is just a simple logic, this notion of a recursive algorithm, a process of instructions that applies back to itself, and it keeps going on. Yeah? And it seems like this kind of basic logic applies in much of the known universe. This is an old idea getting back to ancient Greece, something called logos. It's one of these untranslatable terms, and what it basically renders, it sometimes renders as logic, sometimes as word, sometimes as reason. Not fully adequately conveyed by these English terms, but the notion of logos, what the Greeks did, they said that logos is what the cosmos embodies. All of it is logos. And the reason why you study logic, for them, their ancient art of studying logic, is not just to organize your mind and discipline your thought processes and so forth and become a better reasoner and thinker, but beyond that, there's even a spiritual dimension. You study logos, you study logic to get in tune with the nature of the universe, in tune with your place in it. And this is part of how this sort of relates back in a modern way to this notion of fractal landscapes and our discussion of fractals. If you study logic, what you're going to find is not only is it already applied in our technology and so forth, but it may be in the very fabric of the universe. And one of the deeper spiritual elements of logic is, how do you, as it were, come to understand your own mind and that thought process, and then thereby figure out how that balances out with your existence, your place in the universe. That gets into deep philosophical issues. We'll maybe cover this very briefly towards the end of the semester, but keep in mind, as I told you before, the more we get under our belts, the more I can start to show you these various applications of logic. Not just practical, but also philosophical. There are many, many applications of this stuff, but when you do the exercises, it's very dry and it doesn't seem like it. That's just part of the exercise, but it does have many applications. And as we go through the course, I'll try to show you more and more of these. Okay, that's it for now. Do the homeworks, focus on the process, pay a special attention to translations 3.21 because it will be the kind of thing that will show up over and over again in the course. It's worth giving that first homework a really good faith shot and trying to get the exercises right. Watch especially your parentheses. They make a difference, and they will probably be what you make a mistake on when you do the homeworks. If it says something like when you get the grade grinder feedback back, if it says something like not well formed, it almost certainly means you either have too little parentheses or they're in the wrong place. So watch the flashing and where it occurs, and check my both the video as well as the picture files because it gives you nearly complete answers for all of these. All right, see you next time.